It's really great to be joined today by Chip Berlet, who is an investigative journalist, research analyst, photojournalist, scholar, and specialist in right-wing movements. And there is just so much to talk about with him today. Chip, to begin with, you've been warning anybody who will listen about the growing threat of everything that falls under the militia and patriot movements as we sort of know them for decades at this point. Talk to us about how those groups first got on your radar.
Well, it got on the radar of some 30 people back in the 1970s who began to research under the name Public Eye Network and build a national network of people looking at what we couldn't figure out back then, before a lot of revelations about right-wing activity and the FBI COINTELPRO program. We weren't sure if the federal government was working with some of these right-wing groups. And so a group of people set up something called the Public Eye magazine, which is now at Political Research Associates. And we began to struggle over these issues and do research. And we discovered that there was some symbiotic relationship between the federal government and right-wing groups. But the right-wing groups actually had their own reality, and there were many different kinds of right-wing groups. So this scholar named Jean Hardesty, who had been doing research for the ACLU on the anti-feminist women's movement and the Stop ERA movement in the late 70s, she basically set up a think tank where people like me could be paid to do this research, and as well as encouraging other people to network with Political Research Associates, as it's now called. And so we set up basically a watchdog network to look at this that starts in the 70s, really morphs into Political Research Associates in 81. And in 2000, 2001, Matthew N. Lyons and I wrote a whole book called Right-Wing Populism in America, with the tagline, the subtitle was Too Close for Comfort, because we saw the growing inequality in the US feeding into these right-wing groups. And as long as that growing inequality was really hurting people, these right-wing groups were going to grow. And that was our prediction back then.
Well, I'm sure that people can already sort of anticipate the ways in which this conversation will, in part two of the interview tomorrow, lead into how this is relevant today politically. But before we get into that, can you first talk to us about some of the commonly shared characteristics that these different groups often have in common? And I'm talking about, right-wing populist groups, the patriot movement, armed militias, white supremacists, etc. Some that I've identified, and then I'll turn it over to you to sort of expand, correct, or add to this. We have the idea of the government as an entity that could or has turned tyrannical, that we need to defend ourselves from, seems to be one common motif of many of these groups. Anti-Semitism, very, very often a motif of these groups, and scapegoating in terms of placing blame for our current situation, scapegoating of a variety of groups. Those are three traits I've identified.
Absolutely true. Everything you said is spot on. Basically, what you're looking at then is a range of different right-wing groups that go from the right wing of the Republican Party on out to the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazi movement, but with tremendous differentiation in boundaries, although they're porous, between these groups. And so you would start by saying this is an overwhelmingly white Christian movement. But then I'll add, I've interviewed Jewish and Black members of the militia movement. But in some states, there are militia groups that would not tolerate having either a Black person or a Jewish person in their midst. So it's complicated. And that's part of what the research we've been doing tries to tease out. I would say that overwhelmingly they're swamped with conspiracy theories about secret elites running the government up above and lazy, sinful, subversive people down below who are picking the pockets of the average hard-working white American. Now, there are elites and they're picking our pocket, but they're not secret. We know who they are, and both the Democrats and the Republicans choose to just keep sending money up to them and pushing people down the economic ladder. So there's a good reason a lot of these people are angry. There's a great new book by sociologist Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land, which talks about why they feel so ripped off and so dishonored by the government. And a lot of their analysis is true, but a lot of the analysis blames people of color, Mexicans, immigrants, Muslims, and they divert their anger from a target that could change the economic system to be more fair toward these scapegoats. And I'd say that and authoritarianism and a sense that and in some of these groups, drawing the conclusion that if these people are in fact a secret conspiracy and they're out to destroy America and the Constitution as we know it, why wait for them to get us? We have to go get them first. And that you see happening now with the attacks on all sorts of people who are the named scapegoats, which we can talk about tomorrow.
Chip, can you talk a little bit about different elements of these movements have a sort of varying proclivity towards violence to achieve their goals? Some of these groups are more known for using real-world violence and some less so. Can you give us some examples of sort of the range and which groups might be on either end of the spectrum?
Well, it's interesting. You can obviously find out pretty easily that some neo-Nazi groups and some Klan groups have traditionally engaged in physical violence, both individually and on a mass scale. The lynchings by the Ku Klux Klan and its supporters throughout the South, starting in the 1800s after the Civil War, with the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, which Matt Lyons in our book Right-Wing Populism in America identify as the first major social movement form of right-wing populism in the U.S. So you look at that, but I'm a civil liberties advocate too. So you have to say there's methodology and there's ideology. And the ideology of these groups doesn't automatically create a propensity for violence in each individual. So some individuals in the Klan would not become violent, and some individuals who are not neo-Nazis would not become violent, but some do. And so trying to figure out how the government deals with these threats of violence and actual violence in a way that, I know this is going to be hard for some to swallow, doesn't violate the rights of people in these far-right movements to have First Amendment rights. And that's the struggle between what's First Amendment rights and what's a threat of violence, which is sanctioned by laws.
There is an aspect to some more academic writings on this issue. One such writing that you're quoted in extensively, which is Waves of Rancor by Hillard and Keith, which includes, along with many of the groups that we've been talking about, it also includes groups that sometimes are seen by some, although I would sort of push back against this, as left-wing groups, including the Nation of Islam, and even in the way he existed in the 1990s, someone with the views of sort of an Al Sharpton, are sometimes included under the groups, the types of groups we've been talking about. Can you comment on that a little bit in terms of the similarities and differences to the groups we've been talking about?
Well, I would argue that while I'm not a fan of either the rhetoric of the Nation of Islam about Jews and white people and other people that they fantasize about as being their enemy, or Sharpton, who, although, I got to say now, he sort of turned into a spokesperson for a lot of rational, angry thinking in the Black community. But I don't think it's fair to suggest that they have an organized plan for violence. And it's like the Black Panther Party. If you actually look at the violence that was attributed to the Black Panther Party, almost entirely it was provoked by government agencies that overreacted to them carrying guns, which in most circumstances was completely legal. Now we see white people with guns pointed at federal officials who don't get arrested, but we see Black people with guns seen as a terrific threat to us. And by us, I mean the white community. Armed Black people makes us shake and shiver, whereas armed white people is something that, well, that's just them being angry at the government. So there's a kind of a double standard there.
Let's pick it up there. We've been speaking with Chip Berlet. We will continue this conversation tomorrow. We're continuing our conversation with Chip Berlet. He's an investigative journalist, research analyst, photojournalist, scholar, and specialist in right-wing movements and conspiracy theories. Chip, yesterday we sort of started to lay the groundwork for the different types of groups that you've been following closely at this point for decades. Let's contextualize this in what's going on politically right now in the United States. And maybe one way to enter this would be, are discussions about whether Donald Trump and his associates personally are followers of either anti-Semitic, alt-right, extremist right-wing ideals, is that a question that is relevant in the sense that if these groups are believing that Trump is their guy, I would argue it's actually less important whether Donald Trump personally believes any of their rhetoric, because they will be activated in a way that would not depend on Donald Trump's truthful membership in these groups, but rather the perception they're in. Do you agree with that, or do you think that there's a different approach?
No, I absolutely agree with that. That's again how I would analyze it. It doesn't, first of all, the argument similarly is Donald Trump a fascist, or is the current presidential regime fascist? And I study this. I like to say Trump uses fascistic rhetoric to mobilize a mass base which has elements which are in fact fascist. And you look at alt-right and Bannon, who's chief aide, and alt-right includes fascists and neo-fascists and neo-Nazis. So yeah, it doesn't matter whether Trump believes it or not. It doesn't matter whether he is technically a fascist or just a vicious right-wing populist who is racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, whatever, and xenophobic. He's all those things. The problem is what happens to a democracy when people are so cynical and so angry at the caricature of the liberal left and the Democratic Party that the entire constitutional system could break down. Now, that sounds pretty far out there, but there's a great online resource from Professor Bookbinder. It's at the Facing History in Ourselves website, and where Bookbinder says there was a period before Hitler took power called the Weimar period, when society was losing its equilibrium, that it was fragile. He talks about the fragility of democracy, and there were moments that the rise of Hitler could have been stopped by a kind of mass base of rebellion against the regime, in not meaning a violent one, but just basically stopping what was going on and uniting to build a common defense of democracy, and that failed. And it failed because people kept saying, oh, he doesn't believe it, Hitler doesn't believe it, and once he's in office, he'll be under control of all these sensible people. Well, that's what they say about Trump and the Republicans, and you're starting to see some Republicans wake up to the fact that Trump is a very dangerous anti-democratic small d tyrant and authoritarian and narcissist. Is it Can we stop this? I certainly hope so. I'm certainly working with people trying to, but it doesn't matter how you construct Trump. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago called Heroes Know Which Villains to Kill. And it has to do with how rhetoric can prompt people to act on their own to commit violence against the named scapegoats. We saw it in Rwanda, we saw it in Serbia, we saw it in every genocide in history, from the Armenians to the Nazi genocide to Cambodia, to all genocides start with this framework of a demagogue saying those people are undermining our very existence as a people, but the people are defined narrowly. And the rhetoric suggests, again, that we need to get them before they get us.
We're actually going to be interviewing later this week Professor James Whitman, who has a new book which sort of loosely addresses some of the similarities now compared to pre-World War II Germany. And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. Let me play devil's advocate with you for a second, okay? So there are some who will hear our conversation and will say, David, let's grant that you guys are correct. It doesn't matter what Trump's personal views are. Donald Trump is indeed garnering the support of some of these extremist groups. However, we do have freedom of the press. We have an established history in this country where we could not possibly become anything like the authoritarian dystopia that some are sort of warning of. Can you give us some specific ways in which an administration could, if they wanted to, push us in that direction in terms of legislation, in more than just rhetoric, I guess is what I'm asking? What could be done by an administration?
Well, they're already trying to do it, and they've already started doing it. They've have a press relationship where they have demonized any voice that is critical of the government and of Trump. And so that's where it begins. It begins by silencing the press. And you don't need a law to silence the press. You can simply pick the people you want to talk to on TV, who are already part of the project of tearing down civil society in this country, because they're afraid that there's a secret conspiracy of liberals to create big government, which leads to totalitarianism. And totalitarianism was Hitler and Stalin. And that's why, during the Obama first campaign, you saw signs saying Obama is both Hitler and Stalin. That was the thesis of the economic advisors to this entire movement, von Mises and Hayek and Milton Friedman. They think that big government leads to totalitarianism. And the terrible fact is Trump would impose a form of totalitarianism without having to legislate it at all.
What are ways in which this can be fought against? I mean, I'll just say it sort of in the plainest, most broad way. What can the average person do given these tendencies that we've identified and the groups that are being catalyzed by the presidency of Trump? What can the average person do?
Talk to their neighbors, talk to their coworkers, join local groups. I think this is going to be stopped by building local, broad-based groups that span the political spectrum, consisting of people who know that this is a dangerous moment. They've read history, they understand what Trump is doing, and they can push the elected officials in their states, including the ones sent to Washington, to just say no, to break from this regime. And you do that by listening to their fears and their concerns and their complaints and their grievances as well. And you find common language and common ground. I mean, right now I talk about the Democrats and the Republicans as the two stooges of the wealthy. Well, a lot of people think of the three stooges. So I try to get people to think of the Democrats and the Republicans as like the three students. They don't know what to do. And so we got to organize as a plurality to change this.
Is there a particular area where we're trying to stay on top of constant news in so many different areas? We've got pipelines being proposed that would be hugely damaging to the environment and benefiting foreign companies like Keystone XL. We've got net neutrality provisions being rolled back, and the Senate recently voted to allow ISPs to sell your browsing history to advertisers. Meanwhile, we've got the Affordable Care Act, American Health Care Act debacle that's going on. Is there a particular area of legislation that most relates in your mind to the risk of a presidency that is supported by these types of right-wing groups?
Well, I got to tell you, I don't follow legislation as much as I follow ideology and social movements. So I would argue that right now you can think about legislation, but it's the action in the streets and in your neighborhoods that's going to change things. And I say, I understand people have family and work obligations, but I would sit in at an elected official's office if they're not paying attention. I believe in nonviolent civil disobedience. I think it has come to that. I think it's well past the time we can depend on the Republicans and the Democrats to save us. Democracy will save us if we take it seriously.
Chip, in the limited time we have left, I do want to touch on another area that you've spoken about extensively, which is conspiracy theories. Without talking about any specific conspiracy theory, I've had the idea for years that part of what makes conspiracy theories appealing to some is the idea that it's far more scary to believe that really serious aspects of our lives are unpredictable, right? And that horrible, unpredictable things can happen. There are some who would feel better about believing that there was some evil conspiracy and that some of the terrible things that happen in the world are planned and not random. What do you think about that? Is there some aspect of that in terms of what makes conspiracy theories catch on many times?
Well, it's what you said, and remember that there are conspiracies. It's just history is not based on conspiracy. History is based on powerful forces in contest with each other for the shape of how a nation is going to be operated and the world system. So, yeah, bad things happen. Sometimes they're pretty random. Sometimes you can't really, as an investigative reporter, I spend months sometimes on a story. I can't figure it out. There's no there that I can really nail down. When that happens, I say, walk away. When other people get to that point, they start to imagine and create and spread these conspiracy theories about what really happened, even though they don't have any facts that three people who had any kind of brains could track down. There's no there. There's no fact finding. There's just allegations.
We've been speaking with Chip Berlet. Chip, it's been so great speaking to you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much.